Okay, it's 12:30. I'd like to call this meeting of Corporate Services Committee to order. Let's start by looking to see if there are any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Morgan.
Yes, to be consistent with disclosures I've made in the past, I'll declare on the provincial and federal budget submissions, which include asking for money to fund a program that has a benefit to my employer, and so I won't be participating on those components of 2.1 because Western University is my employer.
Councillor Morgan, are you suggesting you're going to vote on part of it or just absent from the entire discussion?
I can certainly participate on all the other components if the committee would allow me to, but since it's all packaged into the one submission, I can't vote on A or B because they're contained within it wholly. So I'm not sure if there's a way to separate it out. I would be prepared to engage in any discussion on any other components, but not on the rapid transit component.
Okay, any other disclosures? Okay, I'm just going to go back to the beginning here because I skipped over a part, which is to read this statement. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility at london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. And as may be the case on an ongoing basis, just in terms of the disclosure around Western University, I have the same potential conflict as Councillor Morgan. I'm also employed by Western University. On the issue of the provincial and federal budget submissions, I don't think that there's a pecuniary interest there for Western in terms of our request for the funding to the City of London. There might be some subsequent thing that's about how that is deployed, and if there was a discussion about that, I would declare an interest at that time. Okay, any items that we'd like to pull from consent other than 2.1, which obviously has been identified already? Deputy Mayor Hubert. Councillor Reynolds. That leaves 5 and 7. Anyone want to pull one of those? Oh, and 3. No? Okay. So let's have a motion for 3, 5.
Yeah, sorry. That's the. Did you call 2.6?
Yes.
Okay.
I called 6.
3, 5, and 7. Any discussion on 2.3, 5, or 7? Councillor Morgan and then Councillor Zaiman.
Yes, on 2.3, which is the mid-year capital budget monitoring report, I believe it's page 40 in our agenda package. I wanted to make a comment on the impacts of tariffs on steel and aluminum on the potential impacts on the municipality. This is something that was discussed at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities meeting, of which I was at the board meeting. And I can tell you other municipalities are starting to do what we've done and assess the impacts that tariffs may have on our operations, both in the short term and over a long period of time. And the impact is not insignificant. And the case that FCM will likely end up making to federal governments as part of its lobby efforts will be about how far infrastructures the dollars are expected to go, and that the government will be collecting a significant amount of money from tariffs, and is talking about how to use that money to support either businesses or industries. And one of the things that we will be discussing is whether it's appropriate to support municipalities in an increased way to offset the costs that they will face based on those tariffs. So I wanted to raise that because it was an item that came up at the FCM, and at the subsequent Corporate Services Committee meeting, there will be a report on the board meeting. It wasn't able to be done in time for this cycle, but I'll bring some more information at that time.
Councillor Zaven.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to speak briefly to item 2.5, which was our asset review. This was an initiative which I appreciate council was supporting myself in putting this forward a number, maybe 2 years ago at this point. I can't remember exactly when, but we're finally seeing the numbers that have come out of this, and I just want to say thank you to our staff for doing a really great deep dive on this. One of the nice things about this is we're now seeing as a result of this, approximately $430,000 in those proceeds that's going to be used to substitute funding for unissued debt. And so it's a really nice way that we do not have to go farther in issuing more debt and can use these funds to substitute for that. And the only other thing, just to clarify from our staff, but I think we're still looking at some other currently closing date properties that will be in addition to this and close to about 430,000 or so. Just looking for some clarification on how we go forward with that.
So through the chair, those are properties that have already been initiated for sale. So there's a process that it takes some time to go through. So as we're continuing those, when those sales close, we'll be bringing those proceeds forward at that time.
Councillor Zaven.
Through the chair, and thank you for that. And just to following up, would we be looking to use the proceeds of those funds as well to offset or to be used instead of unissued debt as well?
So through the chair, based on our current policy right now, there's really 3 tiers that come, one of which being the first one is to release authorized but unissued debt. So that is the choice that we've gone forward. There are 2 other options that we could allocate that for, which would be to offset and increase essentially future generating income potential type of assets. So if there was a purchase that was planned or something that council would direct, this could be a viable source. But I think going down the tree, the debt substitution is probably the most prudent unless we had something specific to allocate that towards.
I saw Deputy Mayor Hubert and then Councillor Van Holst.
So one of the interesting things in the same item, Mr. Chair, was T-Block building. And T-Block has been, it's a heritage building. It's been under, but we've also poured a lot of money into T-Block in the last decade. I remember us doing the windows and all of that sort of thing. So I'm happy to see it here because it really is an underutilized building, one which, I mean, you look at the numbers here and you gotta go, this is a lot of money for us to keep a building that really isn't producing anything for the taxpayers of London. So I'm not gonna go into what should be there, but I think this is a good analysis of what needs to happen to move it forward. Obviously, there's a few community groups in there that are there because really to help them out. But there's other assets around for that as well. So I think this is really a good next step, and I certainly do support it. So thank you, Mr. Chair, on that comment.
Councillor Van Holst.
Yeah, thank you. So just looking at number 2.7, we're helping Reforest London out with the truck. It looks like we've come up with another fine use for the Community Investment Reserve Fund. There's usually a little pushback by some councillors on the use of that as a reserve fund, but I think this is a fine use of this source of financing.
Any other questions about 2.3, 2.5, or 2.7? If not, I do have a couple from the chair. So Related to Deputy Mayor Hubert's question about the building affectionately known as T-Block, what is the sort of time frame that we're looking at in terms of making any changes to that building?
Through the chair. So right now, the building is occupied with tenants. So one of the things that we're looking at is because the tenants are there, they don't have the budget capacity to seek out other space. So that's something that we're looking at right now is if we need to support the groups that are there to assist in relocating, we're anticipating that we would need to come forward in 2020 with a budget request to provide some support to facilitate that. In the meantime, we're looking at alternative options and looking at the market and trying to develop a strategy as to how the process will unfold over the next couple of years to come up with a plan and also ensure that it aligns with the redevelopment of the underpass at Adelaide Street as well, so that the timing will work for seeking potential purchasers if that's where we end up going.
Thank you, and you anticipated my next question, which is how does it line up with the planned work for the underpass? As my colleagues know, part of building the underpass involves a temporary road built into McMahon Park, which is very close proximity to what we're talking about here in terms of T-Block, and it might be difficult to putting that up for sale in the middle of a giant construction project and finding new uses, and I just want to see how that's going to line up in terms of the uses. Okay, thank you very much. I wondered on 2.3, if the treasurer could just give us a sense at the high level what's going on with the capital budget. It looks like a very good news story. We've got a number of projects that are coming in under budget. We've got a surplus in these accounts and it's being returned back to the various sources of financing. But then there's a couple of areas where we're seeing pressure, you know, especially in the future on the capital budget. I wonder if you could just speak to that.
So through the chair, you summarized it well. So we've got a number of projects that have now been closed and we get to return those funding sources back to their or places of origin. So what that does is it does give us an opportunity in the future that should we need funding for other projects that are potentially at risk of being over budget, that is another source that we could consider in the future. So we've looked at the projects that these are the ones at this point where we're really only anticipating one at this point that we flagged as something that we've identified could be a potential budget pressure. So we have some strategies that we're looking to employ, and certainly we anticipate there'll be surpluses in other areas that we may be able to allocate towards this project. So, and if there's anything shortfall, there is a potential submission for the 2020 multi-year budget. So I think for the most part, I think our capital asset monitor, capital budget monitoring has been working well, and we continue putting a lot of focus, and I think that's something that has served us well as we return the sources back and give us a little bit more to draw upon should we need it in the future.
Just briefly, you know, we've had several of these reports now at committee in terms of the capital budget and the monitoring reports, and the magnitude of the surpluses seems to be pretty stable in around the same kind of magnitude. And do we think that that is going to stay pretty similar? Like it's essentially a percentage of the overall capital budget, and we're seeing that regularly we're getting 2 or 3% under, and then it's coming back to us through these monitoring reports and getting closed out? Or do we think that that might change as we're going forward?
So through the chair, this is something that I think when you look at the emerging issues, we're keeping a close eye on. So we've been relatively stable in looking at this. I mean, have had some projects that have gone over, some that go under. So in the end, we've still been in a positive position. Certainly referring back to the tariffs discussion, and if there are other pressures that get placed on the economy and, you know, supply and demand could potentially change that if there, you know, are tariffs coming or other things that could occur in the industry. So we're monitoring the emerging issues very, very quickly, and something certainly that in the development and update of our capital plan as we come forward with future budgets, those are things that we're keeping a close eye on to ensure that our budgets are sufficient and we account for any potential issues that we see coming in the future. So I hope that that won't change, but certainly as we continue to monitor and update our budgets, we would try to incorporate any changes in there if we see anything coming.
Thank you for that. And certainly, I think it's really helpful that we have such tight monitoring on the capital side, so that when we do have pressures of one-time nature on the capital side, and we know, you know, years in advance that we might have an increase in one area, we're having these continuous surpluses on the one-time side, and we can take those and set them aside to kind of offset what we're seeing. It's almost like within the capital budget, a kind of contingency that's operating after projects are finished. And I think that's really helpful, in addition to all the other things we do to kind of mitigate risk going into the future. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about that, colleagues, and I think we'll just open up the vote. I don't see any other questions.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And that brings us to item 2.1, which we've separated because Councillor Morgan has declared an interest on A and B. And so I would look to see if there's any discussion from other colleagues. Councillor Van Holst and Deputy Mayor Hubert.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to discuss the bus rapid transit section, and so that may mean, that may exclude one or more of our committee members. So if the deputy mayor has questions of something else, that maybe he should go first.
Just go ahead, Councillor Van Holst.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we're sending out our proposals to the province, and I see that the one on bus rapid transit, it's a well-written, sort of glowing report about the BRT. I'm just going to describe how I actually don't agree with the perspective. It's a positionality, and I take a different position. So I'm going to go through a couple of the items here. Mr. Chair, talks about more people waiting on rapid transit than any other project. I'm noticing that more people are weighing in daily. So of the hundreds of people that I've talked to recently, 7 are in support of the BRT project. So as I do a rough poll of people, maybe 40% of the people don't really know about it. 40% don't think it's a good idea. 19% may be dead set against it, and 1% are definitely for it. We're talking about the largest ever public engagement exercises. We still got complaints that the engagement was a little bit one-sided, is that the things people wanted to talk about were off the table when we did some of that engagement. We talk about here an economic plan to bring customers to the businesses. I notice a lot of people are still very concerned that we're going to be bringing people to the empty storefronts of businesses that had to close because of the construction impacts. I mean, eventually those would fill again, but there's a big concern that would happen. Our 4th paragraph talks about a better transit is essential. And I might comment there that it's actually just transit that's essential for some people. So for instance, if we're not going to the industrial sections, that's no transit. If people are left behind waiting for a bus, they're essentially experiencing no transit. It's not that the transit they have needs to be better. We just need to be able to fill that fill that need. The next paragraph talks about our transit plan being the right plan at the right time. And I'm afraid I don't agree with that. 20 years ago, I think this would definitely have been the right plan at the right time. But any board of directors making a large investment in a technology should be looking forward and asking what technologies are coming down the line that may have an impact on this. And I think we're missing out on some very big opportunities. And let me just describe 3 technologies that are here or just about to come. One is the Uber Pool. So right now there's a technology where with your phone,
Mr. Chair, point of order, please.
What is your point of order?
Not talking about future technologies, but we're talking about our submissions to the government. So if the council could...
Councillor, Deputy Mayor Hubert, can you just use your microphone? Sorry.
Sorry, I wouldn't come on. If the councillor could constrain himself to what we're presenting to the 2 levels of government, that would be helpful. You know, new technologies that are is really outside of the purview here.
Well, so I've been listening very carefully to what Councillor Van Holst has been saying, and he's certainly tying it into the exact words that are in the submission, and he's giving his opinion, I think, about why he doesn't agree with the submission. So I'm going to let him continue.
Thank you. So the first technology, which is here, it's a present technology, Uber Pool, where you can, with your phone, connect with an app that will send a vehicle to you, and you can tell it where you want to go. It'll dispatch a vehicle, as I said, to you, and it'll pick people up on the way that are going to a similar destination. So that's a really powerful transit technology. Another one might be Waze, which is a technology that can not only tell you how to get from point A to point B, but tell you how to get there the best way based on real-time traffic information. So by putting those two things together, you can see that's a much more powerful technology. And then when we add into it the possibility of autonomous transit technologies, which exist and will likely be in full use by the time we finish the BRT, you can see that we would definitely have a much stronger solution for London's problems. Right now, there's no problem London has that requires a BRT for the solution. The next point I wanted to look at is it talks about the BRT improving the commuting for everyone, and it also talks about some of the other great initiatives that are involved with this. But in a way, we're almost improving that despite the BRT, right? Without the BRT, if we added these other items, that would be great. I'll go back to the point about the cost-benefit ratio, and this is a significant one. I think staff did a fine job with the consultants in following the directions of the province in terms of creating the business case for this, but I think that the business case format that the province provided us was deeply flawed because it didn't take into account other costs, the impact on other forms of transit, cars, for instance. And one thing we may have missed here, and Mr. Chair, I may try and address that with a motion. I'll probably put as an added, but the changes that we're going to make are going to have an impact on London Hydro. I think London Hydro is going to need to make some investment here as well. And if that's the case, any investment that London Hydro makes, the ratepayers will be impacted. And so what I'd like to do is find out what the impact on the ratepayers would be. So I'll be asking us to, as the shareholder, to request that the board of London Hydro give us some estimate on what they think the impact to the ratepayers will be. The next point I wanted to
Councillor
look
Van
at.
Holst, are you suggesting you're going to raise some item under additional business?
Yes, that's. I think that's. I could add it here as an addition, but I don't think that's the best place. So
It's not the best place.
So I think we're in agreement that I'll just bring that up, and the committee, we can discuss that at that time.
Okay.
Yes,
Councillor
there's
Van
going to
Holst?
be.
Could you give me a rough sense of how long you think you're going to be?
Oh, I think I've got maybe a minute and a half left.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chair. We're talking about construction, providing many, many jobs. And of course, anytime we spend $500 million, we're going to be creating jobs and having an impact, economic impact. But that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the best project to be doing that. And we could spend this in other ways, have the same impact. The final point I wanted to make was that it's suggesting here that now is the time for action, and we're hoping that the government expedite the application process. And I'm concerned that we're really asking them to rush what's being a rash decision on our part, having not looked at some other look at some of the other technologies. I think maybe to the next SPPC meeting, I might look at finding a consultant who has experience in the autonomous space and asking them what they see will be possible for us within the 10-year timeframe. And finally, I had one more question. If we're asking them to help us with the 2019 construction season, through you to our staff, just what are we planning to do in 2019? And are we still going forward with the quick start projects that were initially intended?
Ms. Chair.
Through the chair, we are still intending to proceed with some work in 2019. We are doing a procurement options review analysis right now with Infrastructure Ontario that will help inform the type of staging, and we will be reporting back to committee and council with what the 2019 program will look like.
Thank you for that answer. Those are my comments, Mr. Chair.
I believe I have Deputy Mayor Hubert next.
Well, I didn't really see this one coming, frankly, given that the councillor has voted in favor of the BRT plan a number of times. But the problem, you know, I'm just going to take.
I'm going to call a point of personal
Well,
privilege, you know, that I think.
Go ahead,
I think there
Councillor
needs to be a correction made. That I've been voting pretty consistently and opposing this. I think you recall at the beginning, my concern was not supporting the LRT, which I think was a far too expensive option. I like the BRT as a medium way because, of course, it's easy to sell a bus and move on to the newer technologies, which has been my talking point, if you will. So I'll return
Councillor
that to you.
Van Holst.
Thank you.
Okay, so you raise a point of privilege. I'm going to say the facts show that you have voted both for and against rapid transit at different kinds on different questions.
And I
Councillor Van Holst.
appreciate the councillor's concern for emerging technologies and his interest in that. I applaud that, and actually that's one of the key reasons why I didn't support the LRT, and as he just said, I like the BRT. But the comment to say that there's no problem, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, I'm not going to get the exact words right, no problem that is currently on hand that requires BRT defies all of the analysis that we've had about the capacity of our transit system to date. And the very issues that the councillor, my friend, raises here of people being left at the bus stop, about not having the resources to get to industrial areas, and buses being crowded at peak times. Those are the very issues that we're trying to address in this. And quite frankly, one of the problems I have with, and I don't think we're suggesting, and maybe he is, but suggesting that we change this submission, is that at the end of the day, a Uber is a single occupant, except for the driver. I'm going to leave the driver as the driver, okay? It's a single occupant vehicle. It most of the time will be carrying one or two people. It does not move a lot of people off of a single vehicle or single cars or whatever into a more collective mode of transportation. And that's one of the issues. And quite frankly, we address other issues in terms of affordability and social housing, but also in affordability. Uber, whether you like it or not, costs a lot more than a bus fare to get to where you want to go. So there's a number of issues. I think his points are well taken around the future of autonomous vehicles and the future of technologies and all of those sorts of things. I think those are good points. I think we need to be watching them very carefully. But at the end of the day, one of the most important parts about the bus rapid transit project, and I really wish we weren't talking about bus rapid transit. This is about the modernization of transit in the city. It's about the modernization of our roads, because $320 million of this is road work that will have to happen regardless. What we're dealing with about is really who's going to be paying for that infrastructure. It's about the modernization of cycling. It's about the modernization of pedestrian transit in our city. So I even reject kind of the idea that we put the title Bus Rapid Transit on. I think we're painting ourselves into a corner. This is about bringing transit, which is based, and it's not a rush, good goodness. In 2009, we started the first transportation master plan. That was 10 years ago. We're not rushing it. If anything, we're in first gear. And frankly, all of the consultation, Mr. Chair, has slowed it down so much that we can't even get in the ground until 2020. We would have been in the ground in 2019. So this is about London modernizing our transportation system. And it's not just for the L and the 7. This is for Ward 8, where it won't even touch. But constituents in Ward 8 will be able to connect into the rapid transit routes faster, more reliably, and more effectively. So I appreciate the system. I think this is a debate probably for another committee, Mr. Chair, but I just couldn't let it go unresponded to, and those are my views on that. Now, to other issues, which is really why I flagged it, is I'm deeply concerned, and I'm going to say this, I'm deeply concerned about social and affordable housing and some of the issues and homeless prevention. And quite frankly, some of the social issues, we're hearing rumblings out of Toronto, Mr. Chair, about potential program cuts. There was a survey circulated very selectively, I have to say, throughout the province. I got it in the evening on Thursday night because a colleague of mine in my day job stumbled on it, and it was due by 5 o'clock on Friday. It was an omnibus survey looking at what things are important to Ontarians, and large categories like all of child and social services and ODSP in one category. Some of those moves that the government may make, Mr. Chair, we're hearing a date of November 8th that could have a significant and structural impact on both the budget of the City of London and on the well-being of Londoners. And I can't overstate that. We've been down this road before. And so I'm quite concerned, Mr. Chair. I know I've corresponded with our folks in government relations, but I think I want to be on the record as saying, heads up. And I'm afraid it may not be pretty. Most of my colleagues in the social services are quite concerned, Mr. Chair. I'm hearing that feedback right across the province, and there's no robust consultations. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask, Mr. Chair, is that, you know, as we always do, that we start to press both the government in power, Mr. Yurek, but also our other MPPs about a more robust consultation than simply a survey that has a limited circulation.
Any other speakers on the pre-budget submissions? Councillor Zafen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to speak on those other issues, but I think Councillor Hubert covered them very nicely. I'm going to touch back on our submission around BRT and rapid transit. One thing I just wanted to ask our staff was I've heard a number of times from different members of our community that and from federal government that they have not seen our business case yet for bus rapid transit. I just want to say that I think we're following the appropriate steps, and this would be the first real time that we are doing what we're supposed to in submitting that and making our submissions. I just wanted to get some clarification from our staff on that.
Who'd like to take that one? Ms. Scheer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can start, and if Government Relations wants to add anything, they certainly can. We have complied with all appropriate steps in the process so far. The first deadline for this current intake that's coming up is the end of September, and that is when the program needs to be submitted from the province to the federal government. That's a list of projects from municipalities. They have ours, and we expect them to be submitted. We haven't got a date on the full application process from the federal and provincial governments yet to submit the remainder of our work, but we're working hard to ensure we have all those pieces together. The vast majority of them are already in place and ready to be submitted. Of course, the business case itself is complete.
Through the chair, thank you for that. Glad to just have that stated. I think it's helpful for everyone in the community to know where exactly we're at in this process, and we'll be making that submission shortly. One other question I wanted to ask on our submission here. One of the benefits, I think, of the submission that we're doing here and the program that the federal government and provincial government have specifically is around transit funding and transportation funding. But one thing which I know that we do have a significant issue in the city, and I think that this will have a major benefit for, is reducing the infrastructure gap that we have in our city, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I was just wondering if our city engineer or any of our staff could comment on how this submission may not only benefit transit, but reducing the infrastructure gap that we have in the city.
Through the chair, certainly all of the routes that are being considered for the rapid transit implementation will be fully rebuilt, including underground utilities. That is work that would be paid either on the back of the utility ratepayer or the taxpayer. This is an opportunity to leverage funding from higher levels of government to advance that work without it being gone alone, as it were, by the municipality. So certainly it does help move the needle for us on the infrastructure gap.
Through the chair, thank you for that. And one thing that in my couple of years working as a municipal bureaucrat, but also going through my master's of public administration at Western, focusing on local government, one of the things that you will hear from pretty much any municipal bureaucrat anywhere is when other levels of government are looking to come to the table, you do not leave the money on the table because it's not going to be there again. You have to take every opportunity you can. And frankly, as much as people might want to put this somewhere else, this is specifically for transit-related funding. And so when it is the right project at the right time, this is exactly why. It is because these are transit-related funding projects, and we have a business case which is great, which has been worked on, which I don't think is rash. Frankly, I think we have some of the best people in the country working on this project, not only consultants, but our city staff as well, who I have a lot of faith in. This is an opportunity which I don't think we're going to see again for a number of years. And so I think we are ready to make the submission, and I definitely think this is the right submission for the right time to accomplish an incredible amount of goals for the city that we will not have another opportunity at otherwise. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Councillor Morgan.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not going to talk on anything I declared on, but as I said, I only really had an issue with one section of this. I did want to ask our staff a question about the provincial submission. And I know in a subsequent report that we haven't dealt with at committee yet on the operating budget, it talks about our government relations and the progress that has been made on ensuring that money flows from the province to municipalities to cover the costs of cannabis and its impacts. I know the FCM was successful in ensuring that 70% of the revenues would flow to the provinces, but there has yet to be a specific budgeted allocation to municipalities from the province of Ontario yet. So I read the very positive indications that our government relations staff have said about that the government is indicating that they will certainly do that. I wonder if it is, or if not, why it wasn't included as something that we would look for in a pre-budget submission. Will we be looking for a budgeted commitment on this, or are we confident that that would happen in the budget anyways? I'm wondering why that's not something we included, given it would be potentially a significant amount of money.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. The pre-budget submission reflects the core advocacy priorities that are approved by council. I believe these were approved in 2016. So we've remained consistent with those around each of these 4 core areas. Related to cannabis, we are certainly active on that file, whether it's through various channels, associations, or direct advocacy opportunities when they exist. So I suppose that was the reason for not including it in this submission.
Just as a follow-up and to confirm, and I'm sure the answer is yes, but I'll just make sure it's on the record. So we're certainly advocating for us recovering the costs as we've talked about in council before. It's just not one of the priorities that we're emphasizing in the budget submission, but we're still continuing the good work that is clearly articulated in the operating budget monitoring report. There's a really good section on the work that government relations has done, so I appreciate that. But I just want to make sure that it doesn't preclude us from continuing to advocate for that money.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. So we are, as I said, active on this file through the Association of Municipalities of Ontario and also through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And we work with our peers that will see an impact by the legislation as well. So whether that's the Middlesex London Health Unit, police, et cetera, on kind of getting a clear message from London around what the impacts are, and whether that's clarity around the cost impact on the municipality or legislation, et cetera.
And I'll continue to emphasize, as this topic comes up, and it is in the reports today, I think we need to encourage ourselves not only to cover the costs, but I think municipalities as an order of government should share in any excess revenues beyond the costs as well. And I'll continue to say that is a position that we should advocate for. It's not just about covering municipal costs on this. It's about, if there's excess revenues, all levels of government should share that in some way. Because certainly we know that the property tax base can't fund everything that we do, and new sources of revenue would be beneficial to the municipality, and this is potentially one of them on top of our costs.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. I noticed in the homelessness prevention, we're describing some of the challenges that London's having with drugs and addiction. It might be worth mentioning that we've completed the community drug and alcohol strategy with 23 recommendations, 98 action items, and I believe that's in print right now. So that's also a strong action that the city and all our partners in it have taken. Some of those things might need funding, but that's I think another important piece in our actions to deal with this situation.
Okay, I don't see any other discussion. Just a couple of comments from the chair. I thought both the pre-budget submissions were very good. We're touching on the really key, important priorities from the city. We've been pushing on a lot of these fronts for many years. I think they're tangible, very specific requests in a number of cases. And certainly from the AMO and FCM discussions I've been a part of, I feel like a lot of municipalities are pushing in the same direction when it comes to, the timing of the intake, making sure we can get infrastructure dollars at work in the community. One of the reasons that the federal government in particular is so big on investing in infrastructure is because it provides for that distributed economic development and economic stimulus throughout the country. It's a good way of putting federal dollars to work on projects that are going to generate that inclusive economic growth that the federal government is looking for. We obviously have a long list of projects that could be funded, but it's not enough to just describe the projects and make announcements about funding streams. We actually have to build the infrastructure at a certain point, and this is the really key moment where we're going to be looking at the bigger part of the infrastructure funding, especially from the federal government. And I'm not talking about just transit infrastructure, I'm talking about the whole range, including the green infrastructure funding. Making sure that we can actually leverage that money and get our combined sewer separations done faster and sooner. The sooner those things are done, the better, right? And we have a almost unending amount of work to do underground and hundreds of millions of dollars in need. So, these projects and the submissions that we're putting into the federal and provincial government, I hope that the urgency is coming across because there are costs to delaying, right? And if we put these things off, the problems that we're not solving by putting in the infrastructure continue. Also, the cost, generally speaking, goes up. The longer it takes for us to get started, the more expensive it's going to be. We just had a discussion earlier about the capital budget, and we talk about things where we might see pressure on some of the input costs for these capital projects. That's also a good reason to not be delaying. And so I hope that message comes through, not just from us, but also from other municipalities who are looking to deliver on these important capital projects. I wonder if our staff, just as a question, could just talk about what we expect, the cost of delay could be, because I know we have capital plans, we plan out to try and coordinate these things. We're trying to line up the actual funding commitments with the things we actually have to do. And in terms of the sort of cascade from, you know, tendering the project to actually starting it to completing it, we're running up against some pretty difficult timing issues. And I wonder if you could just speak to the costs of potential delay.
Through the chair, thank you. That's a very big question. Certainly, the general rule of thumb is when work is delayed, it costs more to do in the future. When we're talking about work that is investing in renewal of existing infrastructure, where there's an opportunity sometimes for a lower cost intervention in the short term, we may in the future be talking about replacement. A great example are programs that target things like sewer relining. If we're unable to do that sort of work because the condition has deteriorated exponentially through delay, then we're talking replacement at exponentially more cost. Certainly, our experience would be that it is greater typically than the rate of inflation that we would see as consumers. And there's also the impacts in the interim. So in the case of combined sewer separation, while we delay doing that work because of lack of availability of funding, we continue to put overflows into our watersheds, which impacts our downstream rivers. It drives up our cost of of drinking water treatment because we see enhanced eutrophication in our source water. So it's a complicated question, but certainly our experience is the sooner the better, and the more planfully the better. Our plans are predicated on receiving this funding.
Thank you, and I think it's just important to emphasize that part because you know, getting all three levels of government aligned is what the pre-budget submissions are about, right? We're trying to communicate the priorities from council, even if individually we might disagree on any of these particular projects. You know, council is setting out what the priorities are. We have to advocate with a unified voice to the federal and provincial government about what those priorities are. We need to make sure that when these programs come around, that they actually deliver results on the ground for real people. And I think it's really important that we communicate that, especially to the new provincial government. You know, they're just taking over. They're going to be going to their very first budget. I think being really clear about what our priorities are is essential, and making sure that they get a sense of what the community is looking for and what the priorities are. I know when we've been speaking with ministers as recently as the AMO discussions, you know, the CHIPE funding and making sure that the increase that is planned to go up, it's about $600,000. We just spent an entire, about almost an hour at SPPC talking about the issues around homelessness in our community and how they're getting worse. And that $600,000 is vitally important to make sure that we actually can help people and expand services and reallocate resources, because there's only so much we can do with the money that we have now. And that provincial increase, which is sort of scheduled to happen in 2019, certainly when we were meeting with the Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs, we said, this is really important. You know, this is not a small thing that doesn't matter. This is really, really important. And so the pre-budget submissions, I think, can be a launching point for all kinds of discussions at committee. I think it's good that these ones are basically saying the same things to both levels of government. There's some slight variations depending on what we're asking for. I think it's responding to what we're seeing from the federal government in terms of the Reaching Home strategy, right? And say, look, we have a large urban indigenous population in the city. We would like to be a designated community because we think that's important. So I think it's responsive to what we're seeing. It's very clear about what we need. It's communicating the urgency. And I think that's what we need from the pre-budget submission. So I'll be supporting them. And with that, I think we'll open up the vote. If there's a mover, Councillor Zafman, and a seconder, Deputy Mayor Hubert. So this is A and B. We're going to call C separately.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 3-1 with one recused.
That brings us to item 2.2, the Reserves Rationalization Report. Oh yeah, let's do C.
Yeah, I'll move 2.2, but I have.
Sorry, we just need to finish C. That was my mistake.
Oh, we're not finished C yet?
Yeah.
Oh.
We're gonna have the same mover and seconder. I saw them do it.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Brings us to 2.2. Deputy Mayor Hubert.
Interesting report. Amazing. You stick around here long enough and reserve funds become interesting. So I do have a couple of questions about it, in that I understand the rationale which is laid out on, I guess page 23, there's some rationales for all this. But I do have some questions. I mean, particularly around the minimum targets, because when you start to look at the minimum targets and combine funds, some of them have pretty healthy balances. And I think the problem with flatline minimum targets is they're, so 2 months of a big number becomes a really big number. And I'm not sure, and maybe I need some more indication. I mean, take it with assets, for example. There's a number of different ways in which we can calculate depreciation on assets. This is kind of a flat, to use the parallel, this is kind of a flat line way of looking at minimum targets. It's really just like with depreciation. Wow, we're gonna depreciate that asset over 5 years or 20 years or whatever the appropriate shelf life may be. And some of those things we've changed over the years. And this is just saying, hey, we should have 2 months worth in reserve regardless of the area. And when I start to look at some of the balances, reserves are really based on a risk assessment. So what you need to have from a risk point of view, and then making sure you have enough to mitigate that risk. So I'd like some comment just around that. I've always supported having healthy reserves, and the point is well taken in terms of Moody's. I'm not sure how it really impacts our cost of borrowing when we have a AAA for 40, I've lost track, okay, 44 years? How many? 42? Feels like 44. But it doesn't seem to be impacting our assessment from a Moody's perspective with a 42-year run on it. So can you just help us understand what the criteria and how we're looking at that?
Sure, to say when you're at the top, there's nowhere to go. You can't go up, but go ahead.
Thank you, through the chair. So one of the things, just to clarify specifically with respect to Moody's, so Moody's specifically looks at really our ratios with respect to the debt. So in terms of how that balance works, and certainly we're meeting that target and exceed that target. So what we're looking at is really from a cash flow perspective in terms of putting stuff aside. So the general rule of thumb is typically 2 months of working capital. So, and it's really a general rule of thumb, and it's something based on best practices in terms of the industry and something that you would want to strive for. So certainly it's not something that we expect in the short term we would ever meet, but when you look at $30 million with respect to a contingency, it seems like it's a significant balance, but when you compare it to a $500 million budget, and notwithstanding our capital budgets, it's really making sure that we have enough funds in our bank account at any given point to weather through the highs and lows of cash flow that might come in and out. So when you look at how this works with our investment strategies and looking at balances within our reserve funds that are also funding our capital works that are within our projects, it's really trying to look at a practice that you have enough set aside that should there be an emergency and there was some sort of, we did experience flooding in the last year. That's one example. If you had a tornado as an example, which we know just occurred in Ottawa, it's really making sure if you don't have revenue coming in that you've got a source to draw from. And that could go all the way through your cash flow with respect to unforeseen emergencies, all the way through to a lawsuit or something that came out of the blue that the municipality had to pay. So it's really trying to put some context around the balance that we have and really trying to give a little bit of a sense of, do we have more than what we need? So what I would suggest to you is we don't have more than what we need. Are we doing okay? Absolutely, but that's where we're looking at in the long term towards, and as we see our budget grow, so we've used the net budget but the gross budget is that much more significant. So it's basically, as you look at the cash flow coming in and out for when we get our grants, when we have the user fees, a really good example is a lot of our water and wastewater, the funds are actually expended before the revenue comes in. So it's having enough on hand as a general rule that you can draw from those balances to ensure that your cash flow maintains at a consistent amount. Because of course, you have to be able to segregate the portions that you're able to invest long-term versus having amounts available in your bank account to pay for the short-term expenditures that you're going to incur. So that's really where we're going. We're just trying to give some context around what the balances are, and also trying to create some flexibility that should there be unforeseen circumstances, that council has an ability to have some sort of a fund to help mitigate that if that should occur.
Thank you. That gives a good context. So I'm going to Appendix A, if you don't mind, just because what I'd like to understand, A and B, one of the ones that we always watch is severe weather reserve, because that's probably the one that has the greatest variation, flex, you know, is most susceptible to forces that are out of our control. You know, and you reference Ottawa, so Friday night I was up to my waist in water in a lake helping my neighbor because his boat had swamped and his dock had broken. So I know about storms a little bit. It was 9 o'clock at night and it was black as it can be. But, so that's one, the severe weather one is one that we watch closely because, you know, Mr. Parsons will have, you know, he's drawn on it big time because it's a bad winter or whatever it happens to be. But on Appendix A, if I understand this right, basically the target would be a reserve of tax-supported water and water rate supported of somewhere around $125 million as a reserve amount. And basically what we're saying is we're $75,000 short on that based on target. Am I without doing
75 million?
Is that about right?
75 million. Not 75,000. I wish it was only 75,000.
Sorry?
75 million.
Sorry, 75 million. I just pretend that there is no zeros there. So 75 million. So the question I have is, and this report's all good and fine, and I'll move it, Mr. Chair, is in the next 4-year budget, what steps are being planned, if any, to make that up? Because quite frankly, that's a monster of a tax increase if you're going to make that up, even over a 10-year period.
So through the chair, thank you for that question. So this is going to be a very, very long-term strategy and something that we're looking at 10, 20 years plus to get through. Do I think that we're ever going to hit that number that we're identifying as a target? Likely not. Do we need to hit that number? That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to do some additional assessment with in terms of that's certainly what best practices would suggest should be your target. So I think even if you were to look at 1 month as opposed to 2, we're still nowhere near there. So that's something as we look at surplus deficit, other opportunities that come forward to not draw down from those reserves. Certainly something we don't want to do is to start to increase the tax rate to move toward funds to contingency. That's certainly not the intent. But I think it's really an awareness of what a contingency is and that it's our rainy day fund and it's there to support the council in terms of meeting the things that may come up, but not necessarily something to supplement our operating budget where we have done in other times. And we do use that to mitigate tax impacts in the long run as well. So it's really trying to look at a strategy of how we can move that forward and look at ways in which, so surplus deficit policy is certainly one way that we can look at, and that's as we go forward and start to look at the long-term strategy, that's what we'll be looking at as ways to build that up, but very, very gradually over time as we have opportunities. No different than, you know, some of the policies where we've done debt substitution and moved from life cycle maintenance from debt being fully sourced. It's something that we've done very, very gradually so that we can mitigate all the impacts on the taxpayer.
The only comment I would make is, and certainly from a council perspective, and I'm sure people in your department, some of you folks have got the background on this, is some of them I might say, you know, 1.5 is a more appropriate target. Because I don't believe in setting targets that are, A, we have no intention of actually getting there, and B, we have no capacity to get there. I believe in stretch goals, but I don't believe that that's also a prudent way, because first of all, it's a little, you know, if someone comes in and audits you, heaven forbid, and you say, gee, I should have this amount, and you're showing that you're showing a $51 million gap, then that's going to flag it from an audit perspective. But if you say, no, we have our target's actually 1.5 on a monthly, then, and we have this 10 to 20 year plan to get there, then that's going to be much more satisfactory from an audit perspective. So that's why I'm saying straight line 2 may not be appropriate. The fuel stabilization at $500,000 may be totally adequate. I don't know, but, and maybe it isn't, but what's the appropriate level? And so I'd like to, Mr. Chair, ask, I don't think I need a motion on it, but just I think we need a little bit more discriminating analysis about what those levels are, and that the targets are real targets that connect to some financial plan to get there. So if I could I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the answers and all of that, but this is just how we think about this is important.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My parents always told me to save for a rainy day, and that's why I liked living in Ireland. Every day was a rainy day, so you didn't have to worry about it. But here we do. I'm pleased with page 26B. We're talking about restricting the future use of the efficiency, effectiveness, and economy reserves to a couple things. But one, investments with returns. Of course, they were talking about some revenue generation, or at least returns that would reduce other costs. How hard are we looking for those opportunities? Is that we see them when we come up, or have we got some people actively trying to search for those things, because they're just maybe better places to put our reserve funds than in an account?
Through the chair, so that is something that we have initiated numerous projects through that. So one of the things that we've looked at is returns are broader than just truly financial. Some of the efficiencies as well as quality service, it is a little bit broader in terms of return, is not purely financial, because there can be components that will have great return from the city as a whole that may not necessarily pay for itself in the long run, but which will have a huge efficiency and improve customer service. So that's when we're looking at return as a truly from a benefit perspective. But we have had a number of initiatives. I mean, our LED lighting, I think that's probably the biggest one that I can reference where we have utilized that, and which it has actually continued to pay back over time. I know there's a couple others in the works and a few other ones that we've looked at over the time that have gone forward. So it is something that we've kind of intrinsically used as we look at through service review. If there are opportunities, capital projects, anything that would have that opportunity, it's something that we've tried to build into the day-to-day reviews of any projects, that there is an opportunity here to look at ways to make that move forward and provide a funding source to be able to make some of that stuff happen where we might not have otherwise had the funds in the capital budget to do so.
That's good. Thank you very much. Looking at a few of these reports, I thought it might be helpful to see a little bar graph of what the reserve fund was and what the target was, where you could see how much we've got, where we're going for that. That would be a really easy visual to get a great sense of it. Maybe that's possible the next time this report comes around, but thank you.
Any further discussion? Okay. Councillor Morgan.
I'm sorry, I was waiting to hear what my colleagues had to say on this, and so I don't have as much to cover because you covered a lot of the things. The one thing I wanted to bring up that came up from both Deputy Mayor Hebert and Councillor Van Holst was the idea of the minimum target, and the Treasurer said we may actually never meet it. And it makes me think that the outright restriction on the use of the EEE reserve funds until such time as the minimum target is achieved seems almost overly restrictive. I certainly support some level of restriction on them, but until a target that we may not achieve for 20 years, given that the way that money flows into that fund, mainly through, I think, gapping of positions, means we could have a very large fund and we may not have all the opportunities to deploy it in those restricted ways. And although I do know that would help us get to the target faster, I actually have seen the fund be used very effectively in previous years, and I'm hesitant to always be over restrictive on either council or our staff on this, knowing that we can always, notwithstanding a policy, we're always encouraged not to do that very often. So I wonder if either through, a first stage target in the short or medium term, or through relaxing that restriction somewhat in the language, whether our treasurer would be comfortable with us not having it as such a hard and fast restriction in that particular reserve fund because of what it could potentially be used for.
So through the chair, that's something we did look at because we did not want to be overly restrictive on that. So that's where when we defined returns, we were very, very broad. And that's it's kind of middle of the page on page 24 in terms of looking at what that will allow us to do. So I think based on what we've seen come out of that reserve so far it's actually been, everything that we've seen in the last little while actually fits this definition in terms of what has been supported over the last number of years. So it's really, and maybe we can change the wording if that's something that makes it a little bit open, because truly that's what we're looking at from a return perspective. In terms of quality, those are all things that we're looking at trying to achieve in using that fund and having that available to move forward. So I don't believe that based on what we've seen come forward that this would be restrictive based on the broad definition that we've done, because that was certainly not the intent.
Yeah, and my apologies on that. I remember reading that the first time, and then I didn't even link it back when I made my comment, because I do see you call increased service levels or improved service quality as a return. And so I guess it's much more broad-based. I think in the language, it sounds much more restrictive than maybe it is. So I'm glad that you provided a definition, and given that, I'm much more comfortable with it, because all of those things, I just think the fund's been being used very effectively, and I didn't want it to be restricted in any sort of way.
Any other discussion, colleagues? I know this report has been in the works for quite a while. We've been talking about it at different meetings. And I think this is a good place to be landing, simplifying things in some ways, consolidating things that can be consolidated, simplifying some things that can be simplified. When there's a really specific purpose, setting up the reserve fund instead of having it floating around as a reserve. I know that's maybe a distinction that is without a difference for most people, but I think it's actually quite important, and it's good that we're transitioning those. Looking over them as well, I think it's helpful to see a bunch of the reserves all at once. I know it's not everything, right? We still have a lot of reserve funds that are not being reported on in here, but you can get a sense of where the balances are. We usually look at them just in the budget discussions, and then not necessarily on an ongoing basis. And I see some ones there where I have some questions. For example, the building permit stabilization reserve was soon to become a reserve fund, apparently, which I will bring up another time. I don't need to deal with it now. But I also think it's really important that we're setting out some kind of targets, right? Which is, what are we trying to have? What kind of balance are we trying to get to? I think we need to have the discussion about what the appropriate target is. We're using months, but it's essentially the difference between 16.5% and 8.5%. How much money you want to have set aside just in case. And I think for some of the ones that are larger in magnitude, that's the one where I think we need to have a pretty thorough discussion about what's necessary and what's not. I'm glad to see that we are in the position we're in. I think a lot of municipalities are not in this kind of position when it comes to the reserve funds and the reserves. And it's a nice problem to have. How much can we save? Can we save a little bit more? Can we set some minimum targets here? Good discussion to be having. Not everybody has EEE reserve funds either, which is, let's set some money aside, or a funding source, which is through personnel gapping, so that we can take advantage of those opportunities when they come up. That LED lighting one, I think we replaced 20,000 lights, and it's saving something like $1.6 million a year. That's a pretty great savings on something that also improves quality, like the lighting is a bit better out on the road. So it's doing a couple of things, and if we didn't have the money on hand to do that, you know, we would have had to put off some other capital project to make room for it. We had to delay something else that needed to be done that was underground that doesn't necessarily have the returns that the LED lighting does. And I think it's really good that we had this to work from and that we're going in this particular direction. So I want to say thank you to our staff. I know that a lot of work goes into these reports, trying to figure out where we're going to go in terms of consolidating them. Is there a mover and a seconder for that? Councillor Morgan, Deputy Mayor Van, or Deputy Mayor Hewart, sorry.
Closing the vote, that motion carries 5-0.
Okay, I believe that brings us to item 2.4, 2018 operating budget mid-year monitoring report. Questions on that discussion? Councilor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking at the middle page, or the top page 63. The third paragraph says the deficit's mainly driven in by the increased cost to purchase water from the two water boards that supply London with treated water. And I see in those boards, they also have the kind of reserve funds we've been talking about. But I think there's a case where the investments are too large, or too rapid in their reserve funds, and I don't think they need to be charging us as much as they are. Or what I should probably rather say is that the 3% per year sort of exponential increase in the water fees may be too high at this point. And if we were to negotiate something smaller with them, then we would see a mitigation of those costs. So I'm hoping that we'll do something like that. We've discussed it before in the next budget, but that's definitely an item I would like to see addressed. Then jumping to page 65 at the bottom, we've got the table showing the yield offers on our debt, and it looks like people are purchasing our debt at the lowest amount of these. It looks like about 9. And I'm just wondering, would there be other cities that have lower amounts? Are we the lowest of the low? This looks like a great job here, but perhaps staff could comment on that item at our re-offer yield at 2.869%.
So through the chair, so earlier this year when we went to issue the debt, we were requested by the committee at that time to look at, because one of the benefits, of course, was going first. We were able to secure some fairly favorable rates, and the request was to look at just how well did we do in comparison to others. So that's what this table shows you to date, the information that we have, and it does show that we were quite favorable in the end and have recouped some benefits from that and issued at a quite favorable rate in comparison to the others, as well as what we could have achieved if we had issued later in the year.
Okay, thank you. I guess looking at the table, I see that the region of Peel also did quite maybe a little better than us, but I think the fact that we're the early birds, we're catching the worms, and that's great. Thank you. Good job. And I wanted to make a comment on some of the other the cost drivers. So just quickly, number 3 on page 61, I think Councillor Morgan has been addressing this, but maybe we hope at some point that the marijuana will pay for marijuana. because there's going to be some cost for that and social costs as well. The cost drivers on item 6, we're looking at addressing the unpredictable behaviors of particularly drug use. Once again, we've got the community drug and alcohol strategy coming out. I had a question about number 9, which is the bottom of page 62. We're talking about land ambulance, and we're seeing the call volumes increase at 7 to 10% per year. That's a massive exponential growth, and what we're doing to address that. That looks like we've got a budget amendment, some other. Well, maybe I could ask for a little more help. That's pretty alarming to me, and perhaps staff could go into a little more detail on how we're going to face that challenge.
I'm just going to intervene briefly because, we always have the potential with these operating budget monitoring reports to turn it into a mini discussion about like the entire budget, or get into too far into the weeds in areas that are frankly beyond the expertise of the people who are in the room. So we have had discussions at CPSC about land ambulance. We have had discussions during the budget about land ambulance. That is a big topic, and I just want to start with that and say, in terms of the service pressure we see coming for 2019, if we could address that and not the overall service area, because I think we need to have different people here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy with the 1 minute answer.
So through the chair, so the land ambulance services are delivered by the Middlesex London EMS. So we have a cost sharing agreement with them that they do the operation of the land ambulance service, and we pay a portion of the cost that is divvied up through our cost sharing agreement. So we are working with them right now. That is certainly a pressure that we have seen over the last number of years. What they're indicating to us is that that pressure is not declining, and that they are falling behind on adding ambulances to provide the service to support the call volume that they're seeing. So certainly right now we are working with the county on the development of a business case that we do understand that there will be an increased vehicle that they will need to add for next year to address the call volumes, which will be impacting our 2019 budget update. So we're working with them to obtain that information, and that'll be part of our budget discussions for 2019.
Thank you.
Councilor Morgan.
Thank you. First off, I want to commend our staff whenever I see this report, because despite the fact that it's a slightly smaller surplus than we've seen in the past, it represents, there is a surplus, and that represents a really good execution of the budget plan and the fiscal plan, because not only are you executing the spending priorities of the municipality well, not only are you finding the additional savings that we kind of told you to find in the budget, but you're also projecting to do so under the allocated budget amount each and every year for as long as I can remember, which is a really good execution of a budget plan and the right balance of budgeted items and contingency and planning ahead. And so I think we can't underestimate the work that is involved in that. And so thank you to our staff for this report, and I find it very, very valuable, the level of detail, and I appreciate Councillor Helmer's caution about not going into the entire budget discussion again. I appreciate it as information on how we're tracking. However, there is a couple of things that I like to usually ask about in the contributing factors section on why we are where we are, and I'll keep it to one for now, and that is the snow removal. Winter maintenance budget costs were over, and one of the reasons was purchase services and equipment costs. And my understanding was because of the intensity of the snowfall that we needed to bring in extra equipment that we didn't own, and that there was a significant cost to that. I'm just wondering if you can explain the underlying factors to that and how we might mitigate that in the future, or is that just an exposure that we will have in years where there's heavy snowfalls concentrated tightly together?
So through the chair, Ms. Scheer may want to add, but at a high level, in terms of the budget tracking as a whole, certainly this year was a little bit more higher intensity than what we've seen in other years. And certainly we've had snowfall events where we've tracked them, and usually over years, we've done quite well. And certainly that's where the Severe Weather Reserve Fund is. We've been able to mitigate these. We haven't had to draw on that in the historic past, where we've been able to set that aside because we've had surplus to mitigate. So in this case in particular, it was really the intensity in terms of the contracted services, and there's costs that we have to incur to have that all done at the same time. So this was certainly over the January to April period. So as you know, this is as of June 30th, so there's still half a year to go, and based on how we're tracking, the end of the year, we may be okay at the end of the year. So there's a lot of projections that go into this going forward, but it's really on the line by line in terms of where we saw the cost pressures, that it's not all personnel related. There are costs that are incurred to on the specific lines that roll into that. So, and really it's just in terms of how we address the snowfall events, that because they incurred at such an intensity, there were additional costs to have all hands on deck to move that down.
Yes, I appreciate the answer. I certainly understand that, and I think this is one of those items as we move forward to see if there's anything we can do to mitigate our exposure to this, because it's the one area of the budget that we have pretty much zero control over. Like, we can't control how much it's going to snow or how intensely it's going to snow, and we can either look like we've grossly over budgeted or grossly under budgeted without that being any fault of any of our staff. So on this though, because there's a lot of risk and exposure, it is something I'm interested in talking about in the future to see, what actions we can take to make sure that we're well protected from the risk of heavy snowfalls.
Any other discussion? No? Okay, let's have a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Morgan, Councillor Van Holst. The vote is open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
That brings us to item 2.6. This is update number 2, the second update on the harassment and discrimination third-party review. There's a recommendation before us to receive the report and then authorize Civic Administration to add on an additional $200,000 for the review so they can complete the work, which is a single source procurement, so there needs to be an exception, and that's what's being recommended. So I just looked at colleagues to see if there's a mover for that, and if there's a seconder, and then we'll get into discussion. Councillor Zaveman, seconder? Councillor Morgan, okay, discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just concerned about the ceiling of this cost. On page 87, it says, based on experience to date, the cost of this consulting work may exceed the $250,000 exemption threshold limit. And I'm wondering where we think this might end, or should we put a cap on? Should we put a cap on this where they would have to come back to us before spending more?
Sure, so there is a cap now at 250,000. This is recommending that it go to 450,000, so there would be a cap at 450,000.
Okay, and that seems like a large amount for a consultant. Perhaps I just ask staff for a justification for those amounts.
Thank you, through the chair. So in our effort to be open and transparent with respect to the costs they're providing to you as they're occurring, there's two key phases of the work, the investigative processes and the assessment process. They're rolled together and for the purposes of this report, and we're trending towards to being greater than $250,000. We've put the window above that. I can't predict the nature of the types of work associated with the investigations. They have a mind of their own from time to time with respect to how they're accomplished. We're working to mitigate the costs with Barry's team and our team to ensure that we have parameters in place to keep costs in check. And that's the best I can answer at this stage of the game.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps you could just describe briefly how the review of the London workplace culture might be different than some kind of an internal audit.
I'm not sure the nature of the question. I apologize. Could you maybe ask it again, please?
Yeah, so the expense that we're expecting is it more because of the review of our workplace culture, or is it more because of the investigation? Maybe we'll start there.
Thank you. As you can see in the report, we're 18 investigations. Investigations by third parties, external parties out of town are expensive. There's going to be, I'm not going to hazard a guess as to half or 40-60, but it's a significant portion of the cost. The assessment, given the nature, I'm advised last week that we're looking at around 300 assessment surveys have been completed and are available to us, and it closes a week from now. So there's work associated with that, plus the ongoing review of individuals that have and focus groups and the information necessary to do the policy review. So both are significant in their costs. We anticipate it's going to cost greater than $250,000, and we've sought funding beyond that point to ensure that we can get through the process in case there's a lame duck council or any of those pieces to allow the work to continue in order that we can bring it to conclusion in the first quarter of next year.
Okay, thank you. It's very important work. You know, we do need to do it. It just is a large percentage increase, so thank you.
Councillor Zaitman and then Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to touch briefly on this. I very much appreciate our staff bringing this back to us and making sure that we are being aware of exactly what costs we are potentially foreseeing. I know pretty much everyone, when we talked about this initially, that we knew that this might be a costly venture. So it's not necessarily surprising to see the rise in costs. And I think part of that is making sure that this process is open to anybody who wants and feels they need to be involved with it. And frankly, you know, I think it's understandable that we have a firm from outside the city, as we talked about in the initial part of this process, because finding a firm in the city to do this that may not necessarily have other work or involvement with people at the City of London is hard to find. And I think the last thing, you know, as much as this might be a costly venture for us to undertake, you know, I think this is really significant because I think in the future, as this may be a bit even from a budget perspective, but, you know, trying to save costs in the future of having less disputes and less issues with our employees, and frankly having, you know, it's really hard to put a dollar value to people's well-being and mental health and happiness working at the City of London, but trying to ensure that, I think, is really hard to put a dollar value on. So investing in our individuals and our employees is really crucial. So thank you for bringing that forward.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I agree with what Councillor Zaitman said. It certainly is costly. I appreciate that staff have found appropriate financing within the existing operating budgets to fund that and are looking for the authorization to proceed with the work. And as Councillor Zaitman said, you know, the goal of this work is to move towards a workplace that is free from harassment, discrimination, bullying, intimidation, and reprisal. And those things are directly related to the morale of our employees, and morale is directly related to productivity. When people are in a safe, comfortable, well-functioning workplace where they're free from harassment or reprisals, then they enjoy their jobs and they're really effective. And so this is about addressing a very serious issue, but it's also about making investments to ensure that these issues don't continue in the future. And I think the costs, given the potential gains for the municipality and the quality of life of our employees here, are very reasonable. In this circumstance, and I know it's costly, but I think it's important work that has that has needed to be done for many years. And the third party helping with us with this is, yes, a little more costly, but also, given the nature of the complaints and concerns, having an outside independent look at this is a very valuable perspective to have, even if it costs a little more.
Any other discussion? Deputy Mayor Hubert.
So I think Councillor Morgan reiterated a number of points. It's about delivering excellence, and we have to have an excellent environment for our employees to deliver excellence, and that's real value to the taxpayer. And there's two ways of not dealing with these issues. One is an overt, we don't have a problem, and we've acknowledged that there's an issue that needs to be resolved at City Hall. But also the other way of dealing with it, if you don't want to deal with it, is to constrain the resources so you don't actually do the work that needs to be done. So any constraining of resources would be, I think, the wrong signal to send at this juncture. We want to get this fixed, and we want to make sure that we have an outstanding environment for people to come to work and for them to go out and serve the citizens of the City of London. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm very pleased to move this. I do appreciate the transparency, and that council's aware, the community's aware, but also the community needs to be aware that we're serious about getting this right. So thank you.
Councillor Van Holst.
I was just happy to second that motion if it hadn't happened already.
Okay, so this has been moved and seconded. I do appreciate the update. I think it's important as we work through the process that we have these regular updates on what's happening. I think I really see this as particularly costly. I mean, we engage in all kinds of work and hire experts to undertake a lot of work on behalf of the citizens of London. When you hire engineers, you know, they come at a certain cost. When you hire lawyers, they come at a certain cost. When you hire accountants, they come at a certain cost, and we need different people's expertise at different times. And in this particular case, we've hired basically one of the top firms in the entire country to handle the issue and to do the review and take a look at the practices and policies. And of course, that's going to come at a cost. And I think the question is always, what kind of value do you get for the money that's being expended? And I think that this is going in the right direction. I'm glad that employees have felt comfortable to step forward and to come to the third-party investigator. I'm glad that former employees have an opportunity to participate in the second phase of the review. If there's something that they think is of concern, they can go to Reuben Tomlinson and raise it as part of that assessment. I do want to emphasize, since we're talking about it here, that the survey responses are supposed to be completed by the 5th of October, I think is the timeline. So if people have not completed them yet and they want to, I think it'd be a good time to get them in. And also, I think it's good to know that the timeline for the report kind of coming out of phase 2 is sometime early in 2019. So, you know, I think you have to take the appropriate amount of time to do the work properly, but at the same time, it's important that we get it done in a expeditious way. We want to make sure if there are things we could change, that we can make those changes relatively quickly. And I'm glad that that's the kind of timeline we're working on. This is something just started in the summer, and we're really getting underway, and we're going to have it wrapped up maybe 6 months later. It's a pretty aggressive timeline, frankly, for a big organization like the City of London. So I wanted to say thank you to the staff for bringing it forward. Thanks to the employees who have stepped forward to raise these concerns. The first part, sometimes it's very difficult to do that. And I just want to acknowledge that, that they're participating in that process and that we appreciate that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, that brings us to our scheduled item, which we're in no danger of being before 1 o'clock. Sorry for anyone who is here for the tax adjustment agenda. It's taken us a while to get here to the tax adjustment agenda. I will look to just open the public hearing. Deputy Mayor Hubert, Councillor Van Holst, put that on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
At this point, I just look to see if there's any public comment on any items in the tax adjustment agenda. I see Mr. Edmonds is here to answer questions if we might have them. You're gonna get a lot of looks. Sir, are you here for the tax adjustment agenda? Okay. Okay, I don't see anyone else. No one in behind, Mr. Edmonds.
I'll move closure, Chair.
Okay. Okay, that's been seconded by Councillor Van Holst.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Seconder for that, Councillor Zaveman, thank you.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, that brings us to deferred matters, additional business. Councillor Van Holst.
Oh, thank you. I did have a motion that I shared with our clerk. And this was just one for transparency around the BRT. It came up. And that is to request that the Board of London Hydro provide us with an estimate on the impacts the BRT might have on the ratepayer.
Councillor Van Holst, is that sort of in our role at the City of London as a shareholder for London Hydro?
Yes.
Okay, sounds like something you should bring up at SPPC.
Okay. Well, I'll bring it up at that time. Thank you, along with another motion.
Okay. Any other deferred matters or additional business? No? Okay, that brings us to confidential session. There's one item there, 6.1, labor relations, employee negotiations, litigation, potential litigation, solicitor-client privilege advice. So for a motion to go into closed session. Deputy Mayor Hubert, Councillor Zaveman, any discussion? Okay, let's open that up. We'll be in committee room number 3.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And I think since we've dealt with additional matters, we will be adjourning from committee room 3.